Welcome to Spidel's Federal Tax Minute. I'm your host, Catherine Sedan. This week we're covering draft 1099 forms with new lines for certain OBBBA deductions and transition relief for reporting tip and overtime compensation for 2025. Get tax planning moves for individuals, estates, and businesses before 2025 closes with Spidel's 2-hour on-demand webinar advising clients in a post-OBBBA world, tax planning strategies for 2025. You can see topics covered and get registered at spidel.com under webinars. The IRS has released draft forms 1099 NEC, 1099 MISC, and 1099K for the 2026 tax year. The new forms each contain lines for cash tips and Treasury tipped occupation codes. In the case of the draft forms 1099 NEC and MISC, they each also contain lines for overtime compensation. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act creates new deductions for qualified tips and qualified overtime. Self-employed taxpayers can claim the qualified tips deduction as long as the tips are reported on forms 1099 NEC, MISC, or 1099K, and only if the business is not a specified service trade or business. This gives rise to an interesting challenge. How often does a self-employed person receive a cash tip that's reported on Form 1099? In its proposed regulations, the IRS provides examples of tips received by self-employed taxpayers. However, the examples focus on whether the tips received by the hypothetical taxpayers are the type of tips that are allowable for the deduction, but do not mention the 1099 reporting requirements. The fact that the draft 2026 forms 1099 NEC, MISC, and K contain this new information is expected, but there are open questions that the IRS has yet to address in the guidance it's released so far, including questions that were not answered in proposed regulations issued in September 2025 for the new tips deduction. The open questions include the following. How can a self-employed taxpayer claim the tips deduction for tips paid by non-business customers? Only business taxpayers are required to issue Form 1099 NEC or 1099 MISC. One possible answer is that customers should pay with a credit card so that tips can at least be included on Form 1099K, but this still leaves a gap for taxpayers who are not paid via credit card. How can a self-employed taxpayer receive qualified overtime compensation? The new draft forms 1099 NEC and MISC contain lines for overtime. Qualified overtime is overtime paid under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which only applies to employees. What recourse does a taxpayer have if the payor who issues a Form 1099 NEC or MISC does not report how much of the total compensation paid is classified as tips or overtime? And the new draft forms are 2026 forms, so how does a taxpayer claim the qualified tips deduction or qualified overtime deduction on their 2025 income tax return? In Notice 2025-62, the IRS provides tax year 2025 transition relief for issuers of Forms W-2, 1099 NEC, 1099 MISC, and 1099K with respect to mandatory reporting of tip and overtime compensation under OBBBA. The notice provides that employers and other payors will not face penalties for failing to provide a separate accounting of any amounts reasonably designated as overtime compensation, cash tips, or the occupation of the person receiving cash tips. The notice did not, however, provide guidance for payees regarding claiming the qualified tips deduction or the qualified overtime deduction in absence of information provided by an employer or a payor. Register for Spidel's Federal Tax Update on December 18th and 19th and be prepared for tax season. Go to spidel.com and click webinars to register before the current discount ends on November 14th. That's all for this week. Join us next time for another episode of Spidel's Federal Tax Minute.